Hey guys, welcome to episode 8 of the Charleston Daily Mail Prep Football Podcast. I'm Tom Bragg, joined as always by Daily Mail Preps editor Derek Taylor. Week 7, which we just came off of last Friday, was jam-packed with big games around West Virginia. Let's just get right into it with the game you were at, Derek. Hurricane at George Washington. This game, and you looked this up earlier today as we are recording this on a Sunday night, but this game was the 4th highest scoring game featuring a team from Kanawha County ever. The only games featuring Kanawha County teams that had more points than the combined 114 from the George Washington 60 Hurricane 54 game that you were at on Friday. The highest one was the 98 state title game, Nitro 69, Morgantown 52. Second highest was a game between Nitro and Princeton in 2007. That was Nitro 77, Princeton 42. And in 2009, there was a Herbert Hoover 64, Polka 54 game. But this one, GW 60, Hurricane 54, Derek, it had a little bit of it all. You were up there. What did you really take away from this game?
Oh, a lot, actually. First of all, I had to sweat through it worrying about deadline for print that night, wondering how much time I was going to have to get back to the office and write. But once you put that out of your mind and just enjoy what you're watching, it was... still, it was the second time this season that I believe I came away seeing one of the 10 best games I've ever covered. Look, I mean, GW went up 16-0, and it looked, I thought, like they may have Hurricane just beat down quickly and put away. I was really impressed with the way Hurricane came back in that and made that a game, and it stayed a game all the way through the final minute. I mean, Hurricane had the ball deep in GW territory with I think it was a 4th and 6, and Austin Hensley completed a pass to Henry Sorsea that came up less than a yard short of first down mark, which would have been inside the 15, I believe. So they were driving down for the potential winning score. That game was, top notch. I've pointed out in the past where Hensley and Hurricane have come up short against, in big games or against playoff opponents or whatever. This was an instance, however, in which Hensley, who, keep in mind, was taken out of Hurricane's last game 2 weeks ago against Cabell Midland with a separated AC joint in his throwing shoulder, came back and really played well. I think it was 11 of 18 for 208 yards. Didn't throw, of all those touchdowns everybody scored in that game, Hensley didn't throw a touchdown pass, but he was also not intercepted. He was very efficient with the ball. The other thing I came away with, at least from Hurricane's perspective, was Zach Pate. I've been a person, and there's not many, but I think there's several people who kind of look at Zach Pate as a quote-unquote poor man's Ryan Switzer. He's small like him, he's built like him, he's got speed like him. Not quite the Ryan Switzer's level on speed, but he's a similar kind of player in which, they can use him as a running back or receiver. He's a return guy, and he does a little bit of everything. Pate actually carried the ball 30 times the other night, had 227 yards, or right about that. I'm calling that off the top of my head. Really a tough as nails performance. Fortunately for him, he fumbled on GW's 25-yard line in a crucial drive. And Jacob Jackson, GW's senior defensive back, he's also a wide receiver, scoops up the ball and goes 75 yards the other way for a TD that was maybe the tipping point in that game. It's a fantastic thing to watch and just get, immerse yourself in, when you're watching from the sidelines and seeing this back and forth. You go from thinking, oh man, can anybody, play any defense, to just enjoying what you're watching and realizing that these are the two high-powered offenses that are really causing opposing defenses problems.
Getting back to GW for a second, and we talked about this some. What Hensley and Pate were able to do to GW on Friday night, yes, a lot of that had to do with their ability and their talent, but I think, and I'm pretty sure you agree with me on this, that it's kind of maybe exposed that over-the-top pass defense of George Washington. You can throw it deep on the Patriots, I think.
I think you might be able to. I don't know that they have the speed in the secondary that they've had in the last couple of years. Keep in mind, Ryan Switzer was not only an offensive player, he did play cornerback. And in the last couple of years, I mentioned it last week in a podcast, he has absolutely been the bane of Austin Hensley's existence. A couple pick sixes against them. They don't have that kind of speed in the secondary this year at GW. It got to the point Friday night where they put John Alexander back in the secondary in the second half. Now, anybody who follows GW football throughout the years knows that one of the cardinal rules at GW in their football program is the quarterback doesn't play defense. So they're scratching for some speed and athleticism in their secondary that they might not have. Look, the only other team that relies on the passing game that GW has faced yet this year is South Charleston in the opener. But the way South Charleston throws the ball, which utilizes the passing game a lot like a running game with a lot of bubble screens, a lot of short little passes, is a lot different from the way Austin Hensley throws the ball. Hurricane has much more of a vertical passing attack with downfield receivers, downfield throws, and so forth. And he was able to burn GW several times, 3 times on passes of more than 30 yards. All right. Now, there's not many people on GW's schedule remaining that have that kind of ability. One, however, that does is Capital.
I was going to say, Capital, Tyree Pratt and that receiving core for the Cougars, they've got to just be licking their chops thinking about that game.
I would say so, yeah.
They're probably not thinking about that game yet, but when they do start thinking about that game, I imagine they're gonna look to go off probably that night.
Yeah, Capital relies on breakdowns and coverage a lot, and Tyree Pratt's ability to extend plays by scrambling, but with their speed and athleticism of that receiving core, they'll probably draw up some home run balls that night, I'll tell you that much.
Is that game at GW or is it at Laidley Field?
It's to GW this year.
Okay.
Last game of the regular season.
Oh, that should be a good one. And that's rapidly approaching. This season has really started to kind of fly by. I mean, we're basically in the middle of October now. Playoffs get started here in a couple of weeks. Before too long, we'll be up and wheeling.
Exactly.
But kind of a segue there. Speaking of wheeling and some teams you might see when we get to the Super 6, the other big game in AAA, and there were a couple, but the other one we're going to talk about just briefly, that Morgantown-Wheeling Park game at Pony Lewis Field. Now, I was following along on Twitter with what I do for the Huddle every Friday, and that one just seemed like Chazzy Thomas went crazy in the first quarter, maybe part of the second quarter, and then Wheeling Park comes flying back and takes the lead. I believe they had a 16-point lead late in the third quarter, maybe early in the fourth quarter. And then here comes Morgantown, and they have this epic drive, and Chazzy Thomas scores to send it to overtime. Wheeling Park kicks a field goal on the first possession at overtime, and then almost right away, Chazzy Thomas scores another touchdown. I believe he had well over 300 yards, 6 touchdowns, and I'm off the top of my head. I could be wrong about those numbers, but and we'll get into the Kennedy stuff later because there's really not much doubt in my mind, at least, who's going to be at the top of the list for the foreseeable future, barring something crazy happening. But that was I thought that Wheeling Park, and we talked a little bit about this last week, Derek. It was very much a statement type game for Wheeling Park, or at least they had the opportunity to make a statement. I thought they did, even though they ultimately lost that game, going up there and battling Morgantown like they did. I thought Wheeling Park maybe proved something to a lot of people around the state that maybe were a little hesitant to give them credit because they've seen the hype around Wheeling Park teams kind of fall by the wayside before. I don't think that's the case with this year's Wheeling Park team after what they did Friday.
Yeah, I don't think so either. They've got one more big game that they got to play Steubenville High.
That's always tough, man. That's just the teams from up north that end up playing Big Red. I don't think any coach down here envies them being put in that position to have to even think about that because that's a tough game.
I mean, Morgantown had played Big Red a couple times for the last several years, and I remember asking Morgantown coach John Bowers, why are you doing this, really? Because Steubenville now is it's a Class AA equivalent in West Virginia, but and Bowers told me, he said, look, I would rather play Steubenville, a AA level school, and get beat than play, with no offense to anybody, but the school he said was Elkins. And he said the reason is my team is going to learn more about what it takes to be a good football team by playing Steubenville. And, Park's got that one still looming ahead, but I agree with you. I think going to Pony Lewis Field last Friday, and from the sound of it, I was paying attention to my game first and foremost, but the reports I was getting throughout the game was that Morgantown was just going to run away from them. And then the next thing I saw, the game went to overtime? Huh? Massive comeback by Wheeling Park. Kudos to them for that comeback and being able to hang and overcoming an early deficit. But I think you're right. I think that Wheeling Park is a player to be considered, especially once we get in the playoffs here in a few weeks. They're going to be dangerous.
Yeah, I think they're definitely going to be dangerous, and, maybe if they have a couple losses hanging on their record at that point, that's a team that might have to go on the road early, and if you fall in that top 8 in Class AAA, I got to think Wheeling Park, maybe of any of the teams that would be in the bottom half of the bracket, is the team you don't want to see in the first round.
Yeah, if they don't get past Steubenville, I see them ending up right around 6, 7, or 8, and I think they'll get a home game and then maybe go on the road in the second round if, they're lucky enough or fortunate, whatever, good enough
to
pass that. But I think they're top 8 worthy, without a doubt.
Oh, definitely. I definitely think they're one of the top 8 teams in AAA. But as you and I and many of our listeners probably know, just being the best teams doesn't necessarily correlate with where you end up in the SSAC rankings. It is a math formula that is kind of complicated, if you just to put it very simply. But we'll move on from what happened last Friday and start looking ahead at this week. Derek, we wanted to start. You mentioned this to me earlier. Start doing a little bit of a different thing here with us getting into the back half of the season. We're starting to see who some of the players are in each class as far as playoffs and seeding and postseason awards and things of that nature. And you wanted to talk about some of the things that we're going to be covering in the upcoming week, because we're going to start putting more of an emphasis on those teams that you're going to be seeing playing after the regular season's over, and those players you're going to be wanting to keep up to date with for when those awards start coming out.
Yeah, certainly. What tipped it off to me was we've been working on doing these statewide leaders for the first time this season, and it's really taken off. People seem to – I've been getting a lot of really good feedback from it.
Oh, they love it. They love it. Actually, there was one of the radio guys in Charleston, saw him on the street, and he mentioned to me that he absolutely loves being able to go to one place and get the stats. So it's like you said, it's definitely taken off, and of anything on the site, I think it's the thing that people are really, really liking that we're doing different this year.
Well, it's good to hear.
Yeah.
So thinking along that line, those run in our print edition of the Daily Mail on Thursday, we run the top 5, just the top 5 for every category. But what we want to do is move away from just flat out game preview stories, and kind of take a look at some of the kids that are really standing out this year. And we're going to start that early in the week. Mike Daly has got a feature. He took a look at Cody Mitchell from Point Pleasant, a sophomore running back that I think we're going to hear a lot more out of in the next 2 seasons after this. Chris Wade is looking at Cliff Pratt, the wide receiver at Capital, that is little brother Tyree Pratt's favorite target. Cliff's a senior, and as we were talking earlier about the vertical passing game, he's the kid who caught the winning TD, or not the winning TD, but the touchdown against South Charleston and set that game to overtime, and is one of the area's best. This week I'm going to be covering Wayne at Herbert Hoover. I want to get a look at the Pioneers before we hit the postseason, and that looks like my best opportunity to do that. So I want to take a look at Grant Ferguson, their junior quarterback, who was an All-Stater last year. Maybe give my Mason Hodge worship a little bit of a break to look at a pretty outstanding quarterback they've got. Now on Thursday, when we run our statewide stats and all that, we're going to have a feature on Chazzy Thomas. I mentioned briefly in last week's podcast, Casey Hickman is going to have a story on him and his the way he's running away from the pack as far as the Kennedy Award might be considered, and we'll talk a little bit about that later in the podcast. But and then Nick Brockman's going to take a look at Donnie Mays and Craig Snyder, the two coaches that'll meet each other when South Charleston plays Winfield on Friday night. Snyder has a good bit of familiarity with the South Charleston program, being that he used to work in that program, so it'll be a pretty good. I think it'll be a pretty good look at the relationship between those two coaches.
Now, one of the things that we've been doing for a while now, these stats are new, but one of the things that's been going on for a while, the Daily Mail football poll that comes out each week, and we've been sort of trotting it out and running down through them on the podcast the same evening that they're going online. You can find those online right now at dailymail.com/sports and at wvhuddle.com. But starting in Class AAA, number 1, Martinsburg, got 4 first-place votes. They're 6-1. They're at Hedgesville this week. Number 2, Huntington, actually got 5 first-place votes. The Highlanders are undefeated at 6-0. They're at Parkersburg. Morgantown coming off that crazy game against Wheeling Park. The Mohegans are 6-1. They host Musselman. Capitals, number 4, moving up from number 5 last week. They flip-flopped with GW. The Cougars host Woodrow Wilson, while at number 5, GW is at Cabell Midland. That's a big one. We'll get into that here in just a little bit. At number 6, Wheeling Park, they actually remain where they were last week, so the Daily Mail pollster showing respect to the Patriots from the Northern Panhandle, not dropping them after that loss. They host Elkins this week. At number 7, University, the Hawks are 6-1. They host John Marshall. Cabell Midland, number 8 at 5-2. They drop a spot this week after losing to Capital. They, as we mentioned, are hosting GW, and we will certainly get into that. Number 9, Point Pleasant at 6-0. They break out of their tie for 10th from last week to go up to number 9. The Big Blacks host Ravenswood this week. They played very well on Friday against Oak Hill and Jalen Jones, and I understand Jalen Jones might have been hurt, not to the point where he had to stay out of the game, but he wasn't quite himself. We might get into that a little more when we get into the Kennedy discussion. And at number 10, rounding out the AAA Daily Mail poll this week, South Charleston at 5-2. The Black Eagles host Winfield this week. Others receiving votes in Class AAA, Oak Hill, Hurricane, and Lewis County. Lewis County, another team that will be brought up a little later when we start looking at the Week 8 schedule. In Class AA this week, Wayne, perfect 6-0 at Herbert Hoover. That's the game Derek is going to cover this week. At number 2, Bridgeport, 6-1. They're at Liberty Harrison on October 25th is their next game. So Indians off this week. They just had another great game last Friday. They pounded another top opponent in AA in Kaiser, a team that beat them in the Class AA semifinals last year. Bridgeport's looking good, man. What do you think about the Indians?
Well, we talked about it briefly at the office today, and I'll freely admit it on the podcast. When I was filling out my Daily Mail poll ballot today, I had Bridgeport at number 1 for about 15 seconds before going ahead and replacing them with Wayne. I think that now, at this point right now, like at this point at some other time, who am I? Shannon Sharp. At this point, Bridgeport, I would say, is like a 1A in AA. I think that them and Wayne are just on a collision course, it appears. Now, I don't want to dismiss what Frankfurt and Bluefield are doing, but I really kind of
because keep in mind, Wayne still has to play Bluefield.
Mm-hmm. They play down at Mitchell Stadium, as a matter of fact. They got to go to Bluefield in the final week of the regular season. That'll be an interesting matchup because Wayne is not the offensive juggernaut that it was the last couple of years.
No.
They're still a dominant AA team, but to say that they've had the same level of dominance on offense as they did these last 2 years when they've won the title, it's inaccurate. It's not right.
Yeah.
So the way Bridgeport is just mauling people, I would say that they're right there.
And the Indians play in the Big Ten. The Big Ten, we've talked about this. There's so much disparity in the Big Ten because Bridgeport has just separated themselves. They're on a whole nother level. Fairmont Senior is a very good AA football team, and the Indians, like you said, just tore them to pieces 2 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Just like they did Kaiser last week.
Yeah.
In a roundabout way, speaking of the Polar Bears, Frankfurt at number 3, they did a lot like Bridgeport. They beat up on Fairmont Senior. That's 2 losses in a row for the Polar Bears. That's, like I said, I still think they're a good AA team, but Frankfurt kind of surprising me at least. I'd heard a little bit about them, but I didn't expect them to be 6-0 here heading into Week 8, number 3 in the state. I'm sorry, go ahead.
I didn't either, really. That's all I had to say.
Yeah, Frankfurt is they move up from number 4 actually. They flip-flop with Bluefield. They will host Washington this week. And the previously mentioned Bluefield Beavers at 5-1, dropping down from number 3. They host Westside. Number 5, Fairmont Senior, 4-2, maintaining their spot at number 5 after that loss to Frankfurt. The Polar Bears hosting Braxton County at East West Stadium this year. That's one that probably hadn't been played a whole lot with them just recently being a team moving to AA from AAA. I can't remember ever hearing about a Fairmont Senior Braxton County game. Maybe outside of girls basketball or something like that. Nope, I'm sorry.
That's a game that was probably a date that was formerly filled on the Fairmont Senior schedule by Morgantown or University.
Yeah, you're probably right.
Yeah.
Let's see. Oh, I lost my place for a second. Fairmont Senior. All right. At number 6 in AA, Wyoming East 6-1. Warriors are at Shady Spring this week. Number 7, Sissonville 6-1. I'll take a minute here to talk about Sissonville because we've done some peeking ahead with the schedules. And Sissonville's, if all goes as planned, and they should be favored in the rest of their games, it's looking like the Indians have a very realistic shot of being 9-1 and maybe sitting pretty high up there in the SSAC playoff ratings as far as a playoff seed would go. I'm just not sure what to make of the Indians, Derek, because like a lot of the AA teams, especially in the southern half of the state, you can be really good, but you got to play Wayne at some point because you're probably in the Cardinal Conference, and Wayne just tears through everybody. It's hard to place the tag of contender on a team like Sissonville, no matter how good they are, when you see what a team like Wayne did to them, I think.
I agree. Now, there's several times I'm looking at the Daily Mail poll throughout the season and how I've voted on it, and really there's a degree of separation between the upper echelon of AA and everyone else. There's 4 or 5 teams there at the top, and there's a chasm, okay, before you get to the next group, I think. And it's not to be insulting to anybody's program or anything.
No, it's just
like that.
how it is.
But, yeah. Sissonville is a great story because of how far they've come in such a short period of time of Eddie Smolder's, career coaching that program, okay?
Yeah, Smolder's really turned the Indians around the last couple of years because they were not very good very recently, and all of a sudden, like we said, they're looking at very realistically 9-1 in a home playoff game the first weekend.
Yeah, they've got Clay County at home this weekend, then they go to Sherman, then they have Poca at home, and then they go to Braxton County for the remainder of the schedule. They're going to be heavily favored in all 4 of those games. All right, they should wind up the regular season at 9-1. And guess what, Sissonville? You've now entered the realm of having expectations placed on you. You are now expected to go 9-1. Welcome to the party. I think they're going to end up with a 5-6 seed because honestly, you look at that schedule and while it's it precipitates a 9-1 finish for them. They're not going to get many bonus points, all right?
No.
Because Braxton's down, Poca's down, Sherman, Clay. You look at Liberty. Raleigh hasn't won but a couple games.
Herbert Hoover.
Yeah, Hoover is still struggling. Now, Hoover hung with them. We thought that, was a bit of a trap game, last week.
Yeah.
It looked like it early on.
Yeah, Sissonville, and I think they've done this a couple times. They'll hang around and sort of battle and go back and forth with the team early, and then just either late in the second quarter or coming out of halftime. I'm not sure what Coach Smolder's saying to them in the locker room, but they come out with their foot on the gas and pull away from teams in the second half. Obviously, they didn't do that to Wayne, but I know in a couple of their games to this point in the season, that's kind of been the script that Sissonville has followed.
Yeah, I mean, that in the long run, that beating they took at Wayne could be one of the best things for this program. You never know.
Yeah.
Because, like, we talk about these games all the time, that they're measuring stick games. And that was one for Sissonville. It learned, how far they've still got to go to really be a contender. But I tell you what, 9-1 on your resume, it helps bring more kids out next year, I'll tell you that much.
Absolutely. And that's really the name of the game, especially when you're jockeying in that middle class in AA. How many kids can you get out to actually just, bodies on the field? If you've got a little bit of depth and a little bit of talent and you can coach a little bit, that's when you start seeing teams like Wayne and Bridgeport and Bluefield and these other teams that have been in and out of the top spots in AA for a while. But
yeah, I mean that's what they're going to have to do to crack into that top tier.
Yeah. Now, Sissonville's a good story. Another really good story in AA at number 8 this week, Summers County, 6-1. They will host Meadow Bridge. Number 9, Kaiser. Kaisers, they dropped from number 6 last week. They're 4-3. They're the only 3-loss team in any class that's in the poll this week. I've mentioned it several times throughout the history of the podcast. I don't vote in the Daily Mail poll, but I think that I would have a hard time putting Kaiser in my top 10. I get the feeling that maybe they are still getting a little bit of respect from how good that team was last year and how much of that team they brought back, because they just haven't been the same team this year.
They've been bitten a little bit by the injury bug this year, although it hasn't been so bad to call it, roster ravaging or anything like that. Their schedule is a difficult one. Heck, there's AAA teams that play softer schedules than Kaiser does.
There's a lot of AAA teams that play softer schedules than Kaiser does.
There are. But, you start off going to the island and Wheeling and just getting your hat handed to you. And it started it off on the wrong foot. And they lost 24-7 to Oak Hill in week 3. And I think this is one of those things. There's a lot of internal community pressure put on Kaiser football teams to perform well. There's a lot of historical pride in that program, even though they haven't won a title since I believe it was 1970. I could be wrong, could have been 69, but I'm pretty sure that it was 70. And they haven't been to the title game often, just the one time last year since then. Is that when that pressure starts to mount, I think when you're still dealing with high school kids, that the psyche of the team can start to be shaken. And I think that might be a little bit of what we're seeing here from accounts that I've read, from sources that I have in the Kaiser area. All is not well on Tornado Alley, okay? They've got an opportunity this week to get back in the hunt a little bit when AAA Jefferson comes to town, but they've still got to deal with Frankfort, which is their arch rival, across Mineral County. And, there's a very real possibility that Kaiser could go 6-4. I still think that gets them in the playoffs. AA, more than either of the other two classes, has more teams typically make the postseason field with a 5 record, much less a 6-4. I think they'll be all right to get into the playoffs at 6-4. But what happens then is anybody's guess, because depending on the draw, they could end up going to Bluefield or Bridgeport or Wayne in the first round. And now all of a sudden you're talking about a team that was almost exclusively driven by underclassmen last year that played for the state title game and finished 13-1, losing in the first round of the AA playoffs. That's a big letdown. And I don't know what they do to get it back on track other than to just start winning this week and,
Go from
I don't
there.
have the answers, but I know that there's, what's happened to Kaiser has been one of the stories of this year. It really has. And typically, we like to have more positive stories or happy stories, but sometimes you just get head scratchers like this.
Absolutely. Rounding out the Class AA Daily Mail Prep Football poll this week, number 10 Ritchie County at 5-2, moving into the poll after not being rated last week. They are off this week before hosting Tyler Consolidated on October 25th. Others receiving votes in Class AA, Lincoln, Nicholas County, and Philip Barber. Those are the other teams receiving votes. In Class A, still at number 1 this week, Madonna. 6-0, Blue Dons will play a Saturday game this week when they host Clarksburg's Notre Dame High School. At number 2, it is St. Mary's, and they are actually tied with Wahama this week. So 6-1 Wahama, 6-0 St. Mary's, tied at number 2 in the Class A poll this week. St. Mary's jumping up from number 4, while Wahama holds steady at number 2. St. Mary's hosting Magnolia this week. That's going to be a good game. We're one of our games we've got picked to talk about here in just a little bit. Meanwhile, the White Falcons will be at South Gallia, Ohio, across the river. At number 4 this week in Class A, Greenbrier West. Cavaliers move up a spot from number 5 that last week. They will host Webster County. At number 5 this week, at 5-2, it is Wheeling Central, dropping from number 3. They will play Renaissance Christian Pennsylvania on Saturday. They will be the hosts in that game. At number 6, Moorfield. They are 6-1. They're at East Hardy. At number 7, Clay Battelle, the CBs, still perfect at 5-0, are at Cameron. Number 8, Williamstown at 5-1, is at Work County. Valley Fayette, the Greyhounds, are 6-0. They are at number 9, and they will host Parkersburg Catholic on Friday. And at number 10 in Class A, East Hardy, they are 6-0. They play Moorfield this week. Others receiving votes in Class A, Magnolia, Man, Parkersburg Catholic, and Meadow Bridge. Derek, it seems like there's a bit of a similar situation in Class A as in the Class AA, where there's a handful of teams at the top that are undeniably the top teams in the class, and then the handful of teams right after them, it's anybody's guess, and there's a big, not necessarily a chasm like you described in AA, but there's definitely a gulf between those two.
Oh, yeah. With single A, it's difficult to really discern, and I wrote a column a couple weeks ago about teams clinching playoff berths in reality rather than mathematical clinching. But it's so difficult in single A because teams schedule so differently in single A. There's not. Let me explain it. The way Wheeling Central puts together a 10-game schedule is not the same as the way Montcalm puts a 10-game schedule together, or Hannon or 100, or some of the smaller teams that perennially struggle to put football teams together, much less contend for playoff spots. And consequently, when any of these smaller teams has a good core group of players and is able to go 9-1 or 10-0 even, that's going to vault them, into the top 4 playoff seeding, while you'll have a team like Central has already lost 2 games, and who knows, they might lose a couple more. But if anybody's going to argue that Wheeling Central is not one of the 5 or 6 best teams in single A, they got to screw loose. They're just not familiar with the subject matter, in my opinion. It makes it difficult to gauge, but I think you're right. The top teams in single A, there's a bit of a gap between those and the teams that'll maybe even qualify for the playoffs, but haven't in the last decade or more shown any real ability to threaten to win a state championship.
I think the sneaky team in the bottom half of the poll this week. In fact, they're not even in the poll this week. That Magnolia team. We talked a little bit about this. We talked a little bit about this early, kind of like we talked about with Wheeling Park earlier. That is a team nobody wants to see coming to town come playoff time.
Oh, exactly. For all intent and purpose, this is talking about look, they won the Double-A title in 2010, okay? And the freshmen from that team are now seniors. So, I mean, they're not that far removed from Double-A dominance, and they're still right there. They've lost 3 games at home to Lindsley, at Wheeling Central, and at Williamstown by a total of, I think, 15 points, the 3 losses. You know, their 4-3 record is about the most misleading 4-3 record anybody's got in this state.
Yeah, them at 4-3 and Kaiser at 4-3 are worlds apart right now.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, they're not getting housed in those losses by any stretch of the imagination. And once again, you stress who those losses are to. You know, Lindsley, who, you know, is not an SSAC school, but could pound probably half the Double-A teams in West Virginia. Wheeling Central's Wheeling Central, and Magnolia led that game 20-7, I believe, at halftime before Central came back and beat them. And they lost 15-14 at Williamstown on a field goal in the final minute. You know, Magnolia's not far off from being 7-0.
Right.
Yeah, that'll be.
And with that pedigree at 7-0, that team, I gotta think, especially in the SSAC ratings, but the pedigree might matter in our poll. They're up there, top 2-3 at their 7-0 right now.
Certainly. The one team that isn't getting hardly any attention, even in the Daily Mail poll, which kind of makes me scratch my head, is Man. Man's 5-1, all right, and is coming off a 24-20 win over Chapmanville, you know, who I've previously given a vote to in the Daily Mail poll once or twice this season. You know, and Man's also beaten Double-A Riverview, who made the playoffs last year. They beat them 46-8. They've beaten Westside, another Double-A team, 22-14. Another Double-A team, Mountain View, 44-0. Man is on a roll, you know. And they've got Sherman, Pocahontas County, Tug Valley, and Van left. Man should actually run the table at 9-1 and have a nice little resume of a schedule there of defeated Double-A opponents. Man's probably going to be a top 4 playoff seed, folks.
Yeah, with those bonus points that they'll get from that.
Yeah. Yep.
You know, that one just, it kind of creeps up on you. You see the record and you see Man sitting at the with 1 loss, but it doesn't really click until you start thinking about it in terms of who they've beaten and what that means in the larger scheme of things. And a game that's coming up this week, and there's a bunch of games coming up this week that are definitely going to play into that theme of sort of figuring out where things are in the larger scheme. But the one we'll get into for first, George Washington at Cabell Midland. The Knights are coming off that loss against Capital, maybe licking their wounds a little bit, and we kind of thought the same thing coming out of the Huntington game when they were playing Hurricane. But GW and Hurricane, they played that great game last week, but they're just so different stylistically, I think. I think the matchup definitely favors Cabell Midland this week, but that GW team, they seem so hard to predict so far this season.
Yeah, I think it's in part with the unfamiliarity people have with their top skill people. You know, Ryan Switzer and Dustin Krauser absolutely dominated all the attention, really, for the last 2 seasons for GW. And they're gone, and the guys that basically took their place are unknown or weren't at GW before, so nobody was paying attention to them as they came up through JV. For GW, as you know, GW players. Look, Draven Reif is rushed for 1,300 yards this season, you know, and John Alexander has been quietly efficient as their quarterback. I mean, he's 29. He's only thrown the ball 40 times in 6 games, okay, but he's completed 29 of those passes for more than 500 yards, 10 TDs, and only 1 pick. That interception came in the first game of the season, so he's protecting.
Yeah, it's been almost 2 months without an interception for him now.
Yeah, I mean, he's protecting the ball and allowing Draven Reif to make big plays when he can get a hole. And he's shown the ability to do that. Now, this week, I think could be Alexander's biggest game because Midland's pass defense has been questioned a bit, especially since Luke Salmons is adamant about playing his top skill guys, you know, on offense only. They've got a deep stable of running backs, but none of them play defense, okay? Then again, you know, I expected Capital to go deep on Midland. But they didn't. They beat Midland almost exclusively with big play runs by Kayshawn Haley. He had 3 runs of 40 yards or more. I think 2 of them were 50 yards or more. The thing is, GW is going to have a harder time doing that because while Rife has speed, he doesn't have Kayshawn Haley's speed. All right? He's got Midland speed. All right? He has the kind of speed that Midland's backs have. All right? I keep saying all right. I don't know why. GW has to do a better job of stopping the run than it did against Hurricane this past week to have a chance against Midland. Because Hurricane ran for more than 350 yards on GW's defense, which was probably the most unexpected thing to me that developed out of that game.
Yeah,
now,
you expect Zach Pate to get his, but like that, though, that you don't see that coming ever.
No. And other than not the title game, but the Martinsburg semifinal win over GW last year, I gotta be willing to bet that in the 7 seasons I've covered GW, that had to be the highest rushing total against them. I mean, that's up there. That's red flag waving for defensive coordinators kind of stuff. And before Midland played Capital, it was averaging 425 rushing yards a game. Capital held them to like 201. So what Midland's going to do is just pound the ball at GW. They're not much of a throwing team. And GW's got to find a way to stop the run, quite simply. When GW has the ball, though, I do think that John Alexander's arm is going to come into play a little bit more Friday night than it has in the past this season.
I'm interested to see how that accuracy holds up if he's forced into a situation where they're throwing the ball more than, say, like 5 or 6 times a game. If he's got to drop back and throw 10 or 15 or gosh, even 20 passes, it probably wouldn't get up there. But say 10 or 15 passes, I wonder if that accuracy sticks around. I think that'll be a big key in that game. And just where we're starting with the kind of unofficial theme has been looking ahead at the playoffs and how things are starting to shape up for us this week. GW's undefeated right now, but Cabell Midland's got those 2 losses on their resume. They lost to Huntington, they lost to Capital last week. The Knights, they can afford a 3rd loss, but as far as the seeding goes, you don't want a 3rd loss under any circumstance if you're Cabell Midland. Do you? Or is there any strategy to be gained from maybe bumping down a little bit in the table?
Oh, there could be, but I think it's too hard to predict. If you get... I'm going to run afoul of some fans here. I mean, but if you can line yourself up with a first-round matchup, if you have to go to, say, Lewis County or Oak Hill or something like that in the first round, and you're
beatable teams, very beatable teams.
Right, and you're South Charleston or somebody like that, I could see it, but I have a hard time convincing myself that any football coach would ever allow himself to manipulate the system like that.
Right.
Too competitive.
Well, moving on, you mentioned South Charleston. They're playing Winfield this week, and the Black Eagles have kind of been flying under the radar after taking losses to both GW and Capital. That kind of sets them 3rd in the hierarchy as far as where a lot of the attention gets paid with the big teams in the Charleston area. I think they're sneaky good, but I still kind of like GW's unpredictability. I don't think South Charleston's as good as GW, but I think they kind of fit in that same mold where I'm not really sure which South Charleston team you're going to see because they go back up to they go back up to Ripley Friday, and the team that essentially knocked them out of the playoffs with that crazy 7-6 win against the Black Eagles in the last week of the regular season last year, but they go back up there and Ripley's hanging around again at the beginning of the game, and then South Charleston actually pulls away and ends up winning that game rather handily. But there's just that disparity between the two, like how they can look so good at one moment, and I believe they did the same thing in a game you covered at Spring Valley earlier this year, where they really just didn't look like they had their best game going, and then something clicked and they turned it on. What's up with the Black Eagles, man? I have a hard time figuring this team out.
I think they're still putting their offensive line together. Still, even though we're headed into week 8, I I think Donnie Mays is still adjusting, making adjustments, and trying to find the right combination there. I think they're in a situation where their last couple games have been against Parkersburg and Ripley that they've realistically been heavy favorites in, and Donnie has taken an opportunity to try to fine-tune some things. Now, at the same time, I expected them to come out guns a-blazing and flat-out blow Ripley right out of Jackson County Friday night. And when it didn't happen, I wondered why. And, it just looked like it took a while for them to get going. And I've pointed it out before, South Charleston has been a second-half team for as long as I've known them. And, whatever it is Donnie says to them at halftime, it tends to work. But this week, turning attention to this week, with Winfield, this isn't a Parkersburg or Ripley situation.
They're going to have their hands full with the Generals and Chris Turner, I think.
Yeah. I think this could be closer than a lot of people think, just by, if they're just looking at the school names. As I said earlier in the podcast, Craig Snyder knows what they like to do on offense. And, he's got Winfield has enough offensive weapons that, given SC's still somewhat suspect defense, they can keep this thing close. Like you said, Chris Turner, suddenly, John Hathaway has been Winfield's leading receiver all season until this week. Craig Snyder sent me their stats earlier tonight, and suddenly out of nowhere, Turner's their leading receiver. He's also been, he had that big 6 TD rushing game earlier this year. He can do a little bit of everything, and that is doing a little bit of everything for them. I have a hard time thinking that I think South Charleston wins this game, but I don't foresee a blowout. I think Winfield's going to hang with them for a while, and it'll be harder than usual for South Charleston to pull away in this.
A couple teams that we haven't really talked about, really a little bit maybe, but not at length at any point in the season. In Single A this week, that Moorfield-East Hardy game, matchup of top 10 teams in the Daily Mail poll, I will freely admit that I know zero about these two teams. It's a game you brought up to me as one you wanted to talk about, so take it away.
Right on. Look, a couple years ago, East Hardy, I think, made it to the semifinals. Yeah, they made it to this Class A semifinals in 2011 and lost to Wheeling Central, I believe it was. And their coach, Chad Williams, had been, contacting me throughout the season and keeping me, in the loop with info about the team. And I think only one of their players made first team All-State that year, and Chad was livid. All right, coaches get protective, defensive, and a little bit maybe overzealous with their players when it comes to these things. Bottom line, they're just fighting for their guys, and I understand that. But I honestly thought that East Hardy would have been a bit of a flash in the pan. They're not, a big school, and they hadn't really been part of that clique I was talking about earlier, that handful of single A teams that tends to dominate. So I kind of wrote them off a little bit, and that's my fault. Because they were right back in the thick of things last year. They beat Central in the first round of the playoffs last year, as a matter of fact, and gave Magnolia all it wanted in the quarterfinals on the road to New Martinsville. Now, I thought they'd take, again, I thought East Hardy would take a step back after losing some key guys from that team, and actually from the last couple of years. All those guys are gone. But they've got a quarterback by the name of Cole Collier, who's moved into their do-it-all role that they asked their quarterback to.
That's a sweet quarterback name.
It is pretty cool, isn't it? And, the Cougars are back again. They're undefeated. Well, they're 6-0 now. And Williams has done such a good job at rebuilding that program. It had gone through a bit of a lull because, for those who don't know, there's a guy by the name of Dave Walker who's the coach at Martinsburg. Well, his previous job was head coach at East Hardy. And East Hardy was pretty daggone good in the 90s. And then he left to go to Martinsburg, and East Hardy kind of fell off for a while. Now, Williams is a young guy. He's come back and has breathed a lot of life into that program, and I think it's one of the better stories, especially in single A. Now, as for Moorfield, look, this is the team that dominated the second half of the 1990s. And I think they won their last title in 2003. And I think they can actually contend for the Class A title this year, which would be a bit of a flashback for a lot of people. So that's pretty cool. Will Schoonover is their stud running back, and Dakota Vetter. Anybody named Vetter, that's cool. It's spelled Vetter, not like the Vedder, like the Pearl Jam lead singer, but still cool name. He's a solid run pass QB, and they play pretty staunch defense for the most part. Worth noting, Moorfield has to this point given Frankfurt its toughest game of the year. Frankfurt beat them 37-34 in week 2. That's Moorfield's only loss of the season. And these are teams, I think Moorfield's 6th and East Hardy 8th, or are they 10th in the poll?
East Hardy's number 10.
Okay. And this is the Battle of Hardy County. This if this one was local, it'd be the one I'd be wanting to see this week. I'll tell you that much. So if you're anywhere near that, make a drive over into Baker and catch that game, because I'm sure it'll be a good one.
Name dropping Baker. You know it's serious when Derek Taylor starts name dropping Baker. He's going to be dropping War and Big Chimney on us sometimes soon, too.
War's a nice place. I like it down there.
Two teams that you kind of mentioned, not in a great way, just a little bit ago. Lewis County and Oak Hill. I'm trying to think of a polite way to start this, and I'm having a hard time because it's definitely a game that is going to matter ultimately in the way that the AAA playoff seedings and the teams that get in and out and where they're at, how that all shakes out. This is a game that's going to play into that, because these are two teams that are figuring prominently in that, but they're definitely on the outside of that bubble of the teams that probably realistically have a shot of going deep in the playoffs this year. Oak Hill, I didn't think that they were necessarily as good as their record was going into that game at Point Pleasant. I did not expect Point Pleasant to take them behind the shed like they did. Lewis County, you kind of know what you're getting with Lewis County, with what their schedule typically ends up being. They're a team that can realistically get to 6 or 7 wins, really without a whole lot of resistance, and that'll get you a ticket to the dance. And anything can happen once you're in, but it just seems like maybe in Lewis County's situation that they're kind of content to roll the dice and see what they can do once they get into the playoffs. Oak Hill, I kind of get the impression maybe in a little bit of the same boat.
Yeah, I think they're gonna Lewis County, like you said. You know what you're gonna get with them. They'll run a wing tee. They'll play gritty defense, and just try to wear you out. Now, to me, Oak Hill's got to be reeling after getting blasted by Point. They just have to. I mean, that was such a big game for their schedule.
And that's not a short trip.
No, it's not. And 49-15. I mean, seriously, they just got jacked.
Whack-jacked?
Exactly. Jalen Jones, like you alluded to earlier, Jones is a little banged up, and their offense was pretty much exposed by the Big Blacks in that one. Lewis County coach Eddie Vincent, now I've known him from back when he was at BU and I was working in Clarksburg. He's pretty defensive-minded, and it just wouldn't shock me to see Lewis County go down there and hand Oak Hill a second straight loss. It wouldn't in the least.
I wouldn't be shocked by that either.
What?
I wouldn't be shocked by that either. Eddie Vincent, he's a name. When I was in Fairmont, I was working at the Times in Fairmont, was the first time I really had heard of Eddie Vincent. He's an East Fairmont guy, and man, anytime something starts going wrong for the Bees at East Fairmont, you start hearing the people around town clamoring, we got to get Eddie Vincent to come back here. We got to get Eddie Vincent to come back here. So maybe that's a name to keep an eye on, as some of these, if maybe some of the bigger programs, certainly bigger than Lewis County, start looking for a coach. Maybe Eddie Vincent's a guy that they look at.
Well, you mentioned it yourself when you talk about rolling your dice about getting into the playoffs and seeing what happened. Look, how long has it been now? He's been there. Lewis County is pretty much a playoff team almost every year now, which, let's say 8 years ago, was unthinkable.
No, they barely won a game every season, it seemed like.
Exactly. So he's obviously he knows a little bit of how to get some stuff done. Last year, they beat University in the first round and ended up coming down to GW in this. But he'll have them back in the playoffs.
I picked them to beat GW in that game. I was wrong about it, but I picked them to beat GW in that game.
The thing with Oak Hill, moving it back to them a little bit, they're 5-1 right now, but they've got Lewis this week, Bluefield the week after, Woodrow Wilson after that, and Greenbrier East, which has been, if anybody's seen Greenbrier East's offensive numbers this year, the Spartans aren't bad. Ken has been chucking the ball all over the place, and he can run with it too. And a kid by the name of Dalton Klein has about 800 yards rushing for Greenbrier East. All 4 of those games, although all 4 of them are at Oak Hill, are going to be pains in the rear for Oak Hill to win. All right, it is not assured that Oak Hill makes the playoffs. They really need this win this week, because going into that last 3-game stretch of the season on a 2-game winning streak is not where they want to be.
The last game that we'll get into this week, we mentioned this one when we were going through the polls earlier, that Magnolia St. Mary's game this week. I think that's going to be a really, really, really good game, because like we mentioned, Magnolia's really not far off from being undefeated at 7-0. St. Mary's at 6-0. This could, we could be looking at a 2-3 or a 1-2 matchup this week if maybe a couple bounces had gone Magnolia's way. But they didn't, so Magnolia is sitting just outside the poll, and St. Mary's at number 2. Not a matchup between top 10 teams technically, but still a very, very good game in Class A.
Certainly. I mean, this renews an old rivalry, really. This game went back decades as an annual thing until St. Mary's dropped the single A. And now at Magnolia's drop, it's back on, which for people like me who are from that, really the only team that's tested St. Mary's so far is Work County, which has only won, I think, 2 games. One of them being Buffalo, okay? And Buffalo hasn't won a game this year.
Yeah, Buffalo not very good.
Yeah, for whatever happened in week 2, St. Mary's only beat Work County 7-6. Otherwise, they've pretty much rolled over everybody, including beating Williamstown by like 20. All right.
Wow.
But the Blue Devils, yeah. So, what do we really think of Williamstown? Not so sure. The Blue Devils use a variety of different backs. They got Jeremy Pratt, Noah Spitzer, and David Gray. They're all among the statewide leaders in Class A, which by that I mean they all average at least 50 yards a game, per team game to qualify for those leaders. So they've got 3 running backs in that bunch. Now, Magnolia, as we mentioned earlier, was a little bit snake bit early in the season, losing those games to Williamstown, Central, and Lindsley.
Right.
Drew Keller's their leading rusher, and they've had a line of Keller brothers, and Drew being the youngest one. Trey was a all-stater linebacker. There's been a couple others.
Reminds me of, who were the brothers from
Jason.
Parkersburg Catholic? Were they the Black brothers from Parkersburg Catholic? I believe all of them played at Fairmont State. I think there was 20 of them or something like that.
Yeah. So Drew Keller's a senior, and he's their leading rusher at Magnolia. And they got a kid by the name of Eric Smith, a tall kid. He's about 6'5", 210, kind of lanky kid. He's a top receiver, top pass catcher, at least yardage-wise in single A. This should be a good one. Look, Magnolia's playing backs against the wall. They've still got a game later this year against Steubenville Catholic Central, who is 6-0. They've got to deal with them still down the line.
That sounds like 3 different teams.
Yeah, I know, yeah. There's Big Red and there's Catholic Central. But the Crusaders are 6-0, and coming out of that area, being a 6-0 team, Magnolia can't count on anything, going really its way in that game. So
if you get what he's saying.
What's that?
Said you listeners follow along with what Derek's saying there. You read between the lines.
Yeah. Facing St. Mary's, obviously it's a good test for both teams, but, the Blue Eagles are pretty much in a we've got to win out mode, because realistically they might not be any better than 6-4. And when you're talking 5-5, trying to get into the Class A playoffs, the Single A playoffs as opposed to Double A, you don't want to really take your chance.
No, it's next to impossible with all of those teams that end up with just one or even two losses. I mean, two losses doesn't guarantee you a home game in Single A some years. So you've really got to covet those wins in Class A. And that kind of we'll wrap up there with looking ahead at the games that are coming up for Week 8 this Friday. But there are so many games every week that we try to highlight. And one of the other things that we've been doing in recent weeks is Derek's kind of given his thoughts on where the Kennedy Award stands, and we're going to do that. But you've got a definitive top 5 this week. Is that how you were explaining it to me, or am I misunderstanding?
No, you understood it.
Okay.
I think last week I was a bit disheveled and up in the air about what to do with Malik Watkins. It's hard to really tell how that is all going to play out with his eligibility situation at Martinsburg. If he stays eligible, which I don't think he will, he's definitely a top 2 or 3 Kennedy candidate.
Have we heard anything new on that this week, by the way, just to update the listeners? No, nothing new this week?
Nothing new this week. The hearing for a permanent injunction is the 25th, and that's still at the circuit court level. So we're still a ways away from real resolution with the situation. Somebody asked me the other day, a friend of mine by the name of Nathan Martin, hey Nate, asked me if they were going to get this solved before without messing up the playoffs. I said, yeah, I mean, they've still got the hearing the 25th. The playoffs don't start till November 15th. So there's a pretty wide window for the SSAC and everybody to work this out without it really disrupting things. So no worries there. We just don't know right now. So I do have top 5.
Well, let's hear it. I bet I know who number 1 is, and I bet it's the guy that scored all those touchdowns in that Morgantown-Wheeling Park game on Friday.
Yeah, Chazzy Thomas is pretty much separated from the crowd. Right now, the totals I was given late Friday night, through 7 games, he has 1,985 yards rushing and 31 touchdowns. Okay? That's
really good. The understatement of the century, but that's really good.
Right. I mean, he's not probably going to venture into Culbertson land, but he's going to lead the state in rushing by a pretty wide margin, regardless of class this year. Right now at number 2, this is.
You all right there?
Yeah.
Who's at number 2?
Right now, number 2, Draven Wright for George Washington. I think he's going to. Yeah, 1,400, almost 1,400 yards, 19 TDs. He's going to get the glut of the vote in the Kanawha Valley. I'm pretty sure he separated himself from other Kanawha Valley individuals this year. The other thing with that is that he's also separated himself as an individual from the 3 Huntington area AAAs. Okay, Huntington, as good as it is, doesn't have a Kennedy candidate offensive player, right?
Yeah, I mean, you look at guys like Nick Tubbs, and as good as they are, he's not winning the Kennedy Award.
No, none of them.
Same with Casey Thomas at Cabell Midland.
I can, but I don't see Casey Thomas as Cabell Midland's best running back.
Fair enough.
Fair enough. I just don't. And I don't think that the Huntington area media is going to push him as a Kennedy candidate. I just don't see him as one. I'm sorry. But number 3, Jalen Jones from Oak Hill, down a spot from past weeks. Point Pleasant held him to less than 65 yards of rushing. And he's been banged up the last couple of weeks and not getting as many carries and not getting as many yards. With I still think he's the favorite out of the Beckley area, but he's against their tougher opposition now. He's showing that he's not being able to handle the rigors of the season, and getting hurt and banged up is nobody's fault, and you can't penalize a kid for being hurt, but you can't give, at the same time, you can't give an exception or exclusion to a kid while somebody else is running for 1,985 yards in 7 games. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. Hey guys, Tom here. Just a quick editor's note type thing. Troy Markley from Hedgesville, who you're going to hear about from Derek in just a second with his Kennedy list, he dislocated his elbow on Hedgesville's final possession on Friday. He's probably done for the season. So we just wanted to put this note in there. We didn't find out that he was hurt until after we had recorded this, and we're into the editing process. So we just wanted to kind of leave the note here so that you had the full story on him, even though we didn't when we recorded it. Thanks a lot.
Number 4, a new name to the list. Troy Markley, quarterback, Hedgesville. Right?
I was thinking about this the other day because I couldn't remember his name, and we haven't talked about this before at all, so this is just a happy coincidence. I was driving down the road, and I started thinking about who is going to be the AAA All-State quarterback this year. And I remembered Hedgesville has been absolutely lighting it up on offense, especially through the air. And I thought, wonder what the kid from Hedgesville, the quarterback, I'd like to see his numbers. I wonder how he stacks up. I'm glad you brought him up and put him in the list this week.
Well, you're welcome. But Troy Markley, I mean, he's a multi-sport star for them. So if anybody's familiar with the name, you know, he does other stuff. He's a heck of a baseball player, particularly. But this year, 1,700 passing yards. Let's see here before I get into this. They're 4-2. Hedgesville's 4-2. Okay, they haven't been real good lately.
Have they taken their Martinsburg loss already, or is one of those 2 Martinsburg?
No, that's this week.
Okay. I'm looking at that right now. I should do that.
But he's got 1,700 passing yards, 400 rushing yards, 12 rushing TDs, 15 passing TDs. And like I said, I think Hedgesville is going to crack the playoffs. If they get past this Martinsburg thing, they've got a home game against Hampshire on the other side of it. Then they play Jefferson, and then in the season finale, have to go to Woodrow, which is going to be a test by the trip of it.
Yeah, but how did that happen? Did somebody back out of a schedule somewhere on one of those 2 teams? But how does that end up happening? I'm sorry?
It's hard to tell. I know that Woodrow played Musselman, a couple times, and there's and Oak Hill played Musselman this year. So I don't really know what's going on. That'd be interesting, because that's an interesting game to end up the season with. But if they can get in, especially, and this goes into the whole Kennedy thing about being seen by people, voters in other areas. They're likely going to go on the road if they get in. If they can get out of the Eastern Panhandle, I think he might pick up some votes there. And here's the trick: Markley becomes the number 1 option out of the Eastern Panhandle if Watkins is ruled ineligible.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe there's a bit of the Kyle Allard situation where he has to come to a bigger place, basically just with more sports writers that are going to have more eyeballs on him, because
exactly.
we all got to vote in West Virginia if you're a sports writer, or at least a member of the association, as most of us are. I know both of us are. So if you're going to the Huntington area, the Charleston area, the Northern Panhandle, maybe even around Morgantown, those are eyeballs that you haven't had to impress so far this year. That could be swayed, much like Kyle Allard did when he, in the playoffs with Fairmont Senior, basically won the Kennedy Award by coming down to Nitro and putting on a show at Underwood Field.
Yeah, I mean, I think Jordan Roberts did something similar in 2007 at Scott. As good of a year as he had, it was really when he went to Berkeley Springs in the playoffs. And I think that was the quarterfinal round too. And I don't know, scored like 8 touchdowns rushing or something like that, set a playoff record, and that clinched it. So yeah, you're right. We've talked about it before. It's getting out of the area and being seen by a group of other sports writers that isn't used to seeing you and getting their support. And, with his kind of numbers and his kind of athletic ability, if Hedgesville gets into the playoffs, there's your dark horse Kennedy candidate right there, Troy Markley.
And he's at number 4. Who you got at number 5 this week?
Ross Comas from Madonna. I think he's hanging in there, but I don't, he's such a good athlete. He's such a good player, and he's definitely one of the best in the state, I think, regardless of class. Statistically, he's not blowing the world away, though. I think he's on track for probably about 1,200 rushing yards and about 1,200 passing yards, which is real nice, but it's not going to win a single A player of the Kennedy Award. I think he's still going to get a lot of support out of Wheeling. I think he might get incidental third-place votes out of a lot of places that are more familiar with him than not, but I think his chances are diminishing as the weeks go by.
Now, do you have any guys maybe that might be hovering right around that top 5 that maybe might have the chance to crack it before the year's out?
Oh, Mason Hodge. Once the playoffs start and people get a look at how he plays defense and what he does for Wayne, I think he'll get more support along that line. DJ Stewart at Bluefield is a utility guy that does a lot for the Beavers, and as far as they go, so goes his candidacy. I know not many people, I think this is the first time I've mentioned his name all season on the podcast, but he's definitely a quality player. Who knows, maybe Casey Thomas does evolve into a Kennedy candidate. I don't see it, though. I don't see it happening this year for him. I think Savion Johnson in the park is too young, unknown to really be it. Maybe Anthony Bonamico, the running back at Bridgeport, might get into the mix a little bit. I'm pretty sure that he'll get some support out of the Clarksburg area, that's for sure. But by and large, I think that's the group we're looking at this year.
Mason Hodge kind of strikes me as a guy because he doesn't put up these crazy statistics, and obviously he's kind of the one of the main cogs in that Wayne machine that's been rolling for a couple years now. But a Kennedy Award's not really likely for a guy like that, in that mold, but he just seems almost like he was made to be the captain of the AA first team or something like that, along those lines.
No kidding, man. Statue of Mason Hodge. This is Wayne football. It's just who he is, man. And it's awesome that he is that. And I agree with you. I mean, he's almost a lock to be the defensive captain of the Class AA first team defense. He's that good. Everybody knows he's that good, and he keeps getting better. It's just hard for, statewide voters to see someone get better as a defensive player through the course of a year. You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Yep. And that's unfortunate, but, he very well might be the best player in AA.
I think that you could definitely make that argument, but we're not going to make it on this episode of the podcast because we are just going long on these things. This one flew by. We're way up over an hour, and we haven't had to pause too many times for stuff we'll edit out either. So this one's legitimately, legitimately long one. I guess before we go, as always, you can find all of our prep football coverage online at wvhuddle.com. And also at the Charleston Daily Mail at dailymail.com/sports, or you can be one of those kind souls that picks up the print edition that we work so hard on every day. So those are the ways you can get all of our prep football coverage. And we've got all kinds of other stuff too, WVU, Marshall, other high school sports. So that's what you can get in the Daily Mail. If you want to find us online, our accounts for the Daily Mail and the Huddle, the Daily Mail's one is Sports Daily Mail on Twitter. And I believe it's Daily Mail Sports on Facebook. And the Huddle is at WV Huddle, at WV Huddle. Derek, thanks again. Another great week. We're going to try and get some guests on here one of these weeks, guys, but we keep going pretty long on our own, so maybe we'll just keep it to ourselves for a little while. I'm not sure. Anything you want to add before we finish this up, Derek?
No, another good week, and let's keep them coming, man.
A lot of big games. Each week, there's going to be so many more big games just as we start seeing what happens. So keep an eye on that in the coming weeks. For Derek Taylor, I'm Tom Bragg. Thanks for listening, everybody.